On January 13, 2026, tensions between the United States and Iran intensified following Iranian officials' statements that they were ready for war. In response to U.S. President Donald Trump's threats of potential military action, the escalation occurred amid Iran's crackdown on nationwide anti-government protests that had begun on December 28, 2025, triggered by economic collapse and currency devaluation. U.S. officials stated that airstrikes remained an option while emphasizing that diplomacy was still preferred. Regional actors, including Qatar and Gulf Cooperation Council members, cautioned that any military escalation could have severe consequences for Middle East stability. This analysis examines the documented military, economic, and diplomatic dimensions of the current crisis, the structural factors that constrain or enable escalation, and three plausible scenarios for how the situation may develop. The roadmap covers 5 elements: military deployment timeline, sanctions architecture and economic effects, negotiation dynamics and position gaps, regional security calculations, and 3 scenarios for how the crisis may develop. On January 26, 2026, the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group deployed to the Middle East with guided missile destroyers and advanced aircraft, including F-35C Lightning II fighters. On February 13th, the USS Gerald R. Ford joined, creating a dual-carrier presence. Trump characterized it as a massive fleet and stated maybe we won't have to use them, signaling pressure for diplomatic concessions. U.S. Air Force's Central Command conducted multi-day exercises demonstrating rapid deployment and sustained operations. Iranian officials called the buildup provocative. Supreme Leader Khamenei warned any confrontation could spark wider regional war. On February 16, 2026, the IRGC began naval drills in the Strait of Hormuz with warnings to commercial shipping. Protests began December 28, 2025, triggered by economic collapse and 60% projected inflation. Demonstrations spread to all 31 provinces. The crackdown resulted in thousands of deaths. Iranian officials claimed 3,117. Human rights groups estimated 6,000 to 30,000, with thousands more wounded and detained. On January 2, Trump stated the U.S. would rescue protesters and told them help is on its way. Context requires understanding the June 2025 12-day war when the U.S. and Israel struck 3 Iranian nuclear sites, reportedly destroying centrifuges enriching uranium. That action followed collapsed negotiations. Trump had set a 2-month deadline starting April 12, 2025 for agreement. When it passed, strikes occurred. Talks had been suspended since June. Talks resumed February 6 in Oman, then February 17 in Geneva. IRGC stated he arrived with real ideas, but submission before threats was not on the table. Deputy Foreign Minister Tat Ravanki said, Tehran could compromise on nuclear issues if the U.S. showed sincerity on sanctions. Trump said talks would be very important and referenced the June B-2 strikes, stating, we could have had a deal instead. The U.S. seeks comprehensive restrictions on nuclear, missiles, and proxies. Iran insists on sanctions relief and enrichment rights without broad restrictions. The maximum pressure sanctions campaign targets oil revenues, financial institutions, and trade partners. Treasury Secretary Besson said January 2026 sanctions targeted how Iran generates funds used to repress its people. 9 shadow fleet vessels were sanctioned. Economic effects. World Bank projected economy contraction in 2025 to 2026 with 60% inflation. China continues purchasing Iranian oil. India seized vessels linked to illicit shipments in February 2026. Venezuela sanctions disruption affected Iran's evasion networks. In September 2025, UK, France, Germany triggered JCPOA snapback, reimposing UN sanctions. Israel presses for comprehensive restrictions on nuclear, missiles, and proxy support. Israeli Chief of Staff Samir estimated war within weeks or months depending on diplomacy. Israel maintains independent strike capability demonstrated in June 2025. Gulf states warn escalation would disrupt energy markets. Strait of Hormuz carries 1/5 of global oil. Iran struck Saudi Abqaiq facility in 2019 after sanctions pressure, showing capability to target regional infrastructure. China and Russia indicated no direct military support based on June 2025 responses, though economic interests continue. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi warned any war would destabilize the region. Satellite imagery showed Iran received Chinese anti-stealth radar. Congress debates the policy scope. Some favor assertive deterrence through sanctions and military readiness. Others emphasize miscalculation risks and question legal authorization. The $838.7 billion 522.6 defense budget passed February 3, 2026. $8.4 billion above Pentagon request, but below the $1.01 trillion proposed with reconciliation. Budget includes advanced aircraft, nuclear modernization, and $500 million for Israeli missile defense. Resource constraints don't prevent military action but create incentives for limited operations rather than sustained campaigns. Historical precedents show regime change operations produce long-term instability. Iraq 2003, Libya 2011, Afghanistan 2001 to 2021 all exceeded projections and generated unintended consequences. June 2025 strikes were limited, targeting specific capabilities rather than political transformation. That model differs from campaigns designed to alter regimes. Iran's December 2025 protests represented the most significant domestic challenge since 1979. Violent suppression demonstrated regime willingness to use force and depth of public discontent. Opposition figures like Reza Pahlavi advocate external intervention, but effectiveness of pressure producing political transformation remains uncertain. Sanctions and strikes can weaken government capacity but also generate nationalist consolidation by framing challenges as external threats. Competing logics shape negotiations. U.S. maximum pressure assumes economic pain forces Iranian concessions. Iran's resistance frames capitulation as inviting further demands and undermining legitimacy. Neither side has strong incentives to concede absent verification mechanisms and staged implementation. Deterrence credibility matters. Trump's threats create expectations. Inaction after failed diplomacy could undermine U.S. credibility, while unsuccessful strikes could damage strategic position. April-June 2025 pattern set precedent. Deadline passed, strikes followed. Iran faces parallel constraints. Backing down risks domestic legitimacy and regional deterrence. But provoking U.S. response risks substantial damage to weakened capacity. February 16 IRGC drills demonstrate resolve without crossing escalation thresholds. Scenario A is negotiated interim agreement. Both sides accept partial deal addressing urgent concerns while deferring comprehensive resolution. Agreement could include verified uranium enrichment limits in exchange for partial sanctions relief, particularly oil exports. Missile development and proxy support would not be directly addressed, but Iran might accept de facto constraints on expansion while maintaining existing capabilities. This resembles 2015 JCPOA structure, but with limited scope. Conditions required: willingness by both parties to accept incremental progress rather than comprehensive resolution. Verification mechanisms acceptable to both sides. Sufficient domestic political support in Washington and Tehran despite hardliner opposition. Early indicators: progress in Geneva talks. Iranian and U.S. statements indicating flexibility on technical issues. U.S.-European coordination on sanctions relief sequencing. This scenario addresses immediate nuclear concerns while leaving broader strategic competition unresolved. It reduces near-term military escalation risk but does not eliminate underlying tensions. Iran gains economic relief allowing regime stabilization. U.S. gains nuclear limitations preventing weapons development, timeline acceleration. Scenario B is sustained standoff without resolution. Negotiations continue periodically but fail to produce agreement. Sanctions remain with periodic expansion targeting additional sectors. Military forces maintain heightened posture without conducting strikes. Iran continues low-level enrichment and regional network activities while avoiding actions triggering U.S. response. Situation becomes managed crisis characterized by mutual deterrence rather than escalation or resolution. Conditions: both sides conclude military action costs exceed benefits. Domestic constraints limit leaders' freedom of action. Regional actors successfully press both to avoid conflict. Early indicators: diplomatic engagement continuing despite lack of substantive progress. No significant military deployment expansion beyond current dual-carrier presence. Iranian restraint in enrichment levels despite nuclear rights rhetoric. This scenario represents status quo extension with elevated tension but without decisive action. Risk is that prolonged standoff creates conditions for miscalculation or incident. Benefit is that it avoids deliberate escalation while maintaining pressure. Scenario C is military escalation through deliberate strikes or miscalculation. Either deliberate U.S. decision to conduct limited strikes against Iranian nuclear or military facilities, or incident involving U.S. Iranian forces triggers broader exchange. Possible triggers: Iranian interdiction attempts on U.S. flag shipping in Strait of Hormuz, proxy attacks on U.S. personnel, uranium enrichment acceleration to weapons-grade levels, casualties during military exercises. U.S. conducts airstrikes against nuclear facilities, IRGC command centers or missile production sites. Iran responds with strikes on U.S. regional bases, attacks on Gulf energy infrastructure, or increased proxy force support targeting U.S. allies. Conditions: diplomatic collapse without face-saving exit for either side, domestic political pressure to demonstrate resolve through force, unintended incidents during close proximity operations. Early indicators: Geneva talks breakdown with no scheduled follow-up, military deployments significantly beyond dual-carrier presence. Iranian enrichment approaching weapons grade as verified by IAEA. U.S. Iranian force incidents in Gulf. This scenario carries highest risk but also addresses unresolved strategic questions through force. U.S. gains include degrading Iranian nuclear and missile capabilities, demonstrating credibility of deterrent threats, potentially weakening regime domestically. Costs include regional instability, energy market disruption, potential for broader conflict if Iranian response exceeds limited exchange assumptions, strengthening of Iranian hardliners and nationalist sentiment. Israel would likely coordinate or conduct parallel operations. Gulf states would face economic consequences regardless of their positions. China and Russia would condemn action but likely not intervene directly, based on June 2025 precedent. The documented record as of mid-February 2026 shows heightened tension with simultaneous diplomatic and military tracks. Geneva talks February 17 represented continued negotiation commitment despite military buildup. Iranian statements indicated nuclear compromise openness contingent on sanctions relief. U.S. statements maintained comprehensive restrictions objective. The gap is substantial, but continuing negotiations indicate both retain interest in exploring mutually acceptable frameworks. Regional dynamics add complexity. Gulf states continue warning against escalation and likely apply pressure on both Washington and Tehran for diplomatic solutions. Qatar, UAE, and Saudi Arabia face direct consequences from any military exchange: economic disruption through energy markets, security threats from Iranian retaliation or proxy escalation, refugee flows from instability. Their warnings carry weight because they host U.S. military facilities and maintain economic relationships with both sides. Israel maintains comprehensive deal preference and independent strike capability demonstrated. June 2025. Netanyahu government faces domestic pressure to prevent Iranian nuclear weapons capability and has historically acted unilaterally when perceiving existential threats. This creates variable outside direct U.S. Iran bilateral control. Any Israeli operation, whether coordinated with Washington or independent, would affect U.S. Iran dynamics and potentially trigger Iranian response targeting U.S. assets or allies. China and Russia interests involve preventing major conflict, but limited leverage over core strategic decisions. China's economic relationship with Iran provides some influence, but Beijing historically prioritizes its own interests over Iranian preferences. Russia coordinates with Iran on regional issues, but did not intervene during June 2025 strikes. Both issued statements warning against escalation but took no concrete action to prevent or respond to military operations. Their positions reflect desire to avoid regional instability affecting energy markets and geopolitical balance without directly confronting the United States militarily. The structural assessment addresses whether current trajectory indicates war planning or pressure-based escalation. Deliberate war preparation characteristics include military mobilization for sustained campaign operations, reserve force activation, positioning of logistics infrastructure for extended operations, public messaging preparing domestic audiences for prolonged conflict. Current U.S. posture shows contingency preparation. Dual carrier presence provides strike capability and air defense, but not the comprehensive logistics train required for occupation or sustained ground operations. Air exercise focus on dispersed operations and rapid deployment suggests preparation for limited strike scenarios rather than invasion or regime change campaigns. Diplomatic engagement continuing alongside military deployment indicates coercive diplomacy framework rather than war preparation. If the objective were military solution, Negotiations would likely cease or become purely tactical efforts to secure international positioning before strikes. The fact that both sides committed to Geneva talks and discussed substantive issues suggests genuine exploration of diplomatic resolution possibilities, even if gaps remain large. However, coercive diplomacy carries inherent escalation risks. The logic requires credible threat of force to generate negotiating leverage. Credibility requires willingness to follow through if diplomacy fails. Trump's April-June 2025 deadline pattern established precedent that threats have consequences when deadlines pass without agreement. This creates expectation that if current diplomacy fails, military action may follow. The risk is that neither side wants war but both pursue strategies assuming the other will concede, leading to miscalculation when neither backs down. Historical cases illustrate this dynamic. World War I resulted partly from mobilization spirals where defensive preparations created offensive threats prompting counter-mobilizations. Cuban Missile Crisis nearly escalated despite neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev seeking nuclear war. 1973 Arab-Israeli War occurred partly due to misread signals about intentions. These precedents don't predict inevitable escalation but demonstrate that wars can emerge from compounding decisions and miscalculations rather than deliberate planning. Current situation specifics. U.S. military assets in close proximity to Iranian forces create incident opportunities. January 2026 reports of U.S. forces shooting down Iranian drone approaching USS Abraham Lincoln and Iranian attempt to stop U.S.-flagged vessel in Strait of Hormuz demonstrate ongoing tactical interactions with escalation potential. Single miscommunication, equipment malfunction, or local commander decision could trigger exchange spiraling beyond intended limits. Both sides have procedures to manage such incidents, but pressures from domestic politics, alliance commitments, and credibility concerns could override restraint. Iran's domestic situation adds unpredictability. Regime facing severe economic pressure and largest protests since 1979. Government demonstrated willingness to use lethal force maintaining control, but long-term stability uncertain. If regime perceives external pressure threatening survival, calculus may shift toward accepting higher military escalation risks. Alternatively, if protests resume at scale, regime might seek external conflict to rally nationalist support and justify repression as defense against foreign threat. Either dynamic could alter Iranian risk tolerance and negotiation positions. The question returns to whether current policy decisions increase major war probability. Evidence suggests elevated risk but not inevitability. The combination creates conditions where war could occur through deliberate U.S. decision that diplomacy exhausted and limited strikes. Necessary Iranian provocation calculated to demonstrate resolve but triggering U.S. response or unintended incident during close proximity operations escalating beyond control. Probability assessment requires distinguishing immediate triggers from structural enablers. Immediate war this month appears low probability absent deliberate decision or significant incident, negotiations continuing, no imminent deadline, military posture stabilized rather than expanding. Elevated probability over 2 to 6 month timeframe if Geneva process collapses without alternative diplomacy track Iranian enrichment accelerates toward weapons grade as verified by IAEA. Major incident between forces occurs Israeli independent operation triggers. Iranian response targeting U.S. assets or Iranian domestic instability prompts regime to seek external conflict diversion. Structural factors enabling escalation, credibility pressures on both sides from past statements and actions. Military proximity creating incident opportunities. Domestic political constraints limiting compromise flexibility. Regional proliferation concerns driving Israeli urgency. Economic pressure on Iran creating incentive for risk-taking. U.S. resource commitments creating preference for resolving Iran issue decisively. Factors constraining escalation. Gulf state opposition providing diplomatic off-ramps Chinese and Russian. Messaging against conflict congressional questions about authorization and objectives. Military preference for limited strikes over sustained campaigns given resource constraints Iranian. REGIME survival instinct, avoiding existential threats both sides stated preference for diplomacy as articulated by officials. The assessment. Maximum pressure diplomacy combined with military deterrence creates high-wire environment where outcomes depend on tactical decisions, signaling clarity, and incident management as much as strategic intentions. The documented pattern suggests preparation for multiple contingencies rather than commitment to single outcome. This is characteristic of crisis management, where maintaining options represents both prudent planning and escalation risk. Final analytical note: information environment affects risk perception and decision-making. Political messaging emphasizing threat and resolve can shape public expectations, making the escalation politically costly, even when strategically preferable. Media narratives framing interactions as inevitable conflict can create self-fulfilling dynamics. Counter-narratives emphasizing diplomatic progress can create space for compromise but risk appearing weak to domestic audiences. Both Washington and Tehran navigate these information dynamics while conducting military and diplomatic operations. The summary: U.S. Iran crisis as of mid-February 2026 reflects maximum pressure strategy through sanctions and military deployment alongside active diplomatic engagement. 3 scenarios remain plausible: negotiated interim deal, sustained managed standoff, or military escalation, deliberate or accidental. Outcome depends on decisions made by both governments, regional actor influence, and tactical incident management. Current trajectory does not indicate deliberate war planning but does create elevated escalation risk through credibility pressures, force proximity, and domestic constraints on compromise. Monitoring indicators include Geneva talks progress, military deployment changes, IAEA enrichment reporting, regional incident frequency, and domestic political messaging in both capitals. We continue tracking developments as they emerge from diplomatic channels, military activities, and economic indicators.